Hello, everybody. Wonderful that you made the time to come here at point 3 o'clock. We hope that you've had a great lunch and a great OECD experience up to now. We're not quite sure whether you, ladies and gentlemen, might want to stay, or you're welcome to stay, of course, or whether you might want to proceed to the next thing. And with that, after the heartfelt welcome, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is probably one of the most complicated and longest titles of any OECD session that we're going to have. And let me just do a couple of words of introduction, then we'll give the floor to each and everybody. And again, thank you very much, Minister, for having made it possible to come here last minute. So that's absolutely fascinating. We have politicians here, we have trade union representative here, we have academia here, and the basic topic, despite the complicated title, ladies and gentlemen, is about how do we face the transition that we're all seeing happening, on top of which there are the transitions within the climate change, and therefore the need to change things drastically, not just because there are a couple of people out there on the streets protesting, but simply because that is one of the greatest challenges I think our generation is facing. Now, when we say we live in times of change, I think that sounds extremely banal, but we have the effects of climate change starting to be felt. We have some governments already adopting and enforcing active climate policies. We have some parts of the populations all around the world demanding faster action on climate issues, and we're experiencing the changes firsthand. We can already see where climate change is hitting hard on the ground. And of course, it doesn't make any difference whether they're rich countries or poor countries, whether they're rich people or poor people. On top of that, we've had something that's been going on in the last couple of years already. We have this sort of squeezing on a part of the population that used to be sort of quite well off, the so-called middle classes. And funnily enough, we will hear that in the US, that didn't used to have or didn't used to be thought of as having class system. There is something like an emerging upper middle class, and there's also a squeezed middle class. So many, many, many things are going on. And the question today is, how can we deal with that? How can we find the right policies? How can we enforce the right policies? And above all, how can we take everybody along to do exactly that? Now, we have, as I said, this absolutely fascinating panel here, and I would like to turn to the first person to pick up the thought process. And Norbert, we've decided that you're one to state your ideas first. You're State Secretary for Environment of the Ministry of Environment in the Slovak Republic. Now, I've noticed, of course, that your country has already undergone a lot of changes after '89. Now, the second wave of changes is coming. You yourself have been involved with creating EU policies, driving them forward, and also involved in some of the OECD panels. Where do you see the most urgent changes that you need to make? Where is the transition that you observe? And maybe sort of, give us a hint of where your government is thinking of going.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Norbert Kurla. I'm the State Secretary at the Ministry of Environment in Slovakia, but I have some rich experience in EU policy making in Brussels. I used to serve there for a couple of years. So maybe I'll try to provide a Slovak, a national perspective in a combination with a European perspective. And basically, the transition, what we know, towards more low carbon, climate resilient and resource efficient economy is unstoppable. In doing so, we are not only decarbonizing, but we are also modernizing our systems, our lives, our society. And having in mind, as you hinted, we have some experience in Central Europe already with some reforms, with some restructuring, especially after the communism. Our heavy industries actually fell very hard, and they had to undergo a very, very difficult and painful process in order to stay alive. And now, with this new challenge of taking very concrete climate action in order to continue with the decarbonization, I think they will have to contribute again, but hearing and having insights also from them, I'm sure they want to be part of solutions. So we have an EU system in place which also makes a case for Slovakia. We have some sectors that are tackled already in this harmonized system, for example, emission trading scheme. We are regulating energy and industry. And then we have other sectors, especially like transport or residential sector, agriculture, waste management, managed kind of on a national basis. We don't really always have a harmonized EU approach. And this is one of the sectors that we feel we need to do more. And we see also low-hanging fruits, especially when tackling issues like energy efficiency. In residential sector, there is a great potential to create new, greener jobs, but also to kick on economy. So we are quite aware what we need to do domestically, but in order to arrive into the biggest challenge is to decarbonize our economy over decades. So we aim to be climate neutral by 2050, even though it's very ambitious, but we try to listen to the scientists. The recent IPCC report was very alarming. And if we are not changing our way of our operations, of daily operations, it will be very critical and very difficult to meet this challenge. So we have, for Slovakia now, we have very different maybe economy compared to others. We are not services-based economy. So we are still very traditional, heavy industry, energy-intensive sectors. So we will have, through the climate action and through the decarbonization, we will have also many losers. So we need to create a system that is also socially fair and provides just transition, because there will be many people losing their jobs. Of course, digitalization is also one of the reasons, and the automation, that we will perhaps need less people in future. And so we need to be really very comprehensive and very strategic on this. So number two, greening of the financial systems. That's something that we are working actively at the EU level, but also national level, because we need to shift also taxation. But we need to create enough enabling frameworks to support green investments. We have there's actually lots of money around. That you have many institutional investors that are really sitting on trillions. And sometimes they also continue investing or providing wrong investments, especially they are locking us into the fossil world, and they are not prepared and are not actually ready to take a step or a faster step ahead. So we are both working at the EU level to support green financial products, green bonds, new way for business, and this is what we are trying to do both at the EU level and national level. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Also sticking to your 4 minutes, because that's what we agreed in advance. I'm very happy that Emmanuelle Vergon was able to come last minute. She is Minister of State attached to the Ministre d'État, Minister for the Ecological and Inclusive Transition, and I think there's already a lot of music in that title. Now, of course, everybody who's been reading newspapers and has not sort of disappeared to Mars will have noticed that France is actually a boiling pot for the issues that we're addressing. On one hand, you've had the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, that are out on the streets saying, yes, you've put in a policy, but we don't agree because we have to pay for it. It's too expensive for us to survive. On the other hand, you've actually got a couple of groups saying, we're going to take the French government to court because they're not moving fast enough. I mean, right at the moment, it sounds like you're a bit squeezed. So how do you feel to be in that position?
Thank you for the question. Merci beaucoup. Je vais m'exprimer.
Thank you. I'll speak in French, and I'll try to stick to the 4 minutes that I've been given. On the overall vision and the roadmap, I completely agree with the Slovak Secretary of State. We're exactly in the same dynamic. France also wants to be decarbonated by 2050. We signed the COP21 Paris Agreement, and we have high ambitions in all these areas: residential reform, and transportation, agriculture, to carry out the transformation. What is also true, as you just recalled, is that while we're moving forward with this ambition, we've been caught up in a movement in France, the Yellow Vest, the Gilets jaunes, and this was started or sparked by the increase in the tax on carbon. And they have said you're going about it the wrong way. So the title of this panel, "The End of the Month or the End of the World," is precisely what it's all about. And there was this whole public debate. Can we reconcile the two? The two have to be antagonistic. So this is fundamentally a question of public policy. And we have not yet found the answer, but gradually we are working on solutions. Traditionally, in France, there was always an opposition between economic prosperity and social prosperity. How is it possible to develop industry, to increase competitiveness, to make our companies stronger in conditions where everybody benefits, including the poor households, including all workers, through the sharing of value and social policies? And now, what we've seen fairly recently, we have a new dimension in play. Rather than having, on the one hand, those who are for economic prosperity, and on the other hand, those who are for social prosperity, and those who are fighting for an equilibrium between the two. Now we have a three-facet discussion: the economic, the social, and the planet. And the planetary dimension is absolutely essential because we know, since the Paris Agreement, we have very little time left to act and to fundamentally overhaul the way we live. So the question is, can we invent, are we able to invent in France and in Europe? And I totally agree with Norbert, because it's a European question. It's a matter of a European vision. And France is a certain model of a society that would be economically prosperous, competitive, that would be socially fair, and that would also be ecologically accountable. And that's why my ministry is called the Ministry of Ecological Transition with Solidarity, because that was exactly the belief of the current minister and this government, that the ecological transition has to be against a backdrop of solidarity. So after our great debate in France, which was a time that was set aside for political discussions in various venues in France, both intangibly, that is online, but also through real meetings with over 1 million people who participated, what is good is that many people said we should not do the ecological transition. Rather, people said we know we need to do it for biodiversity and climate, but what we need to do is to find a fair way to do it. Each person has to contribute to this ecological transition: individuals, companies, and the major economic actors. So the question is not so much out of the two are opposed, but how can we make the transition fair, unified, and across the board?
I didn't start speaking straight away, but I would really like to listen to the last words. Now, the word fair is, of course, something that trade unions have always been about. If we look at trade unions globally, these days they have become very modernized, they've become very forward-looking. So, of course, the question of climate change is one that you're looking at as well. And here at the panel we have Liz Risgaard, and I hope I've pronounced it properly. She's a president of the Danish Confederation of Trade Unions that has just been merged. The two trade unions in Denmark have just merged with you at the helm. And traditionally, we were looking at trade unions to just look at the social aspect. In how far has your view widened? In how far do you find that mirrors within Danish society a path maybe towards a harmonized approach of government, trade unions, employers, and the people as such?
Yeah, we want to be a part of the society in every way. So to take the big question in climate first, then I can say that there is no job on a dead planet. So of course it's very urgent for us also to be a part of that. But in order also to achieve a green transition, there must be a just transition. So that is what we are working for. And we think that everyone has to recognize also that when we have to do the climate change, then we also have to look at each other and say, this is not for one country to achieve this. This is a worldwide a challenge, so we have to work together to make a just transition, also a green transition. But you know, we see all over, we see the polarization, unrest and less trust everywhere. And that is just not the climate challenge. It's all over. So as in France, the yellow vests are on the street. We have in UK the Brexit, and we have in the US Trump. Yeah, well, so we also see a lot of populist political parties rising. And in many countries, and also in Denmark, where we have an election going on right now, and we have 3 new political parties, and 2 of them is very, very right-wing parties, and that is you know, I see it as a symptom, and we all know the symptoms. But do we also know the cure, and do we recognize what is the cure? And that's why I think it's very interesting sitting in this panel discussing this moment now. So I think we should start at the root of the problems, and then look at the solutions. And seen from my point of view, the problem is consisting of being left behind. Workers left behind, the middle class, in otherwise, you know, we should be positive of the technology, development and globalization. And we are, as unionists, also positive in that way, because we think that we've done it before, but we have to secure that everyone is going on the train. Everyone is taking part of it, and we also have a problem with the economical elites not paying their fair share of you know, the price here, and also the political elite who is ignoring the problems and even awakening. So we have to also take the security and welfare systems in a way that the people are secure. So all this leads to a lack of trust in governments, in politicians, in elite, and that leads to what I say, to the reaction. So the solution, when we have to discuss it, it's actually quite simple. From my point of view, we need to make sure that no one is left behind. We also have to make sure that the economical elite are paying their fair share, and also make sure that the political elite face the problems and strengthen the security and welfare systems. So that's a start.
Great. As I said, there will be a second round at which we are really looking at solutions. Now, of course, some people who are giving advice are scientists, and as we've seen recently, certainly in Germany, scientists are also joining the Fridays for Future on the road. Like, finally, we have some other people listening to us, what we've been saying for years and years and years in our reports. And yeah, we've had headlines once or twice, and but nobody acted on it. That's the impression one gets. So there seems to be sort of, as we say in German, wind under your wings. Michael Mealing, as Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, shortly known as MIT. You've been concerned with the solutions for a number of years, like CO2 pricing, other measures that could be out there. How far are we actually globally, and also maybe in diverse nations, to encompass and to include carbon pricing into this transformation process? I know you haven't got half an hour.
Yes. Always a risk when you have an academic on a panel. Thank you very much for the question. Let me maybe pick up where you mentioned the IPCC. You mentioned the commitment to deep decarbonization by mid-century, and you mentioned the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees centigrade. One thing it says in that report, as you may have read or recalled, is that this requires a transformation that has speed and scale with no historic precedent. It is a huge political, financial, economic, it's a cultural and behavioral challenge. From research, coming from research in academia, which among others, of course, produced the climate science behind this, but also the policy solutions, these have been clear for a long time. So the market failures that underlie climate change, we know what to do about them. We know that we have to have policies to invest in innovation. We need policies to incentivize and to de-risk investment and deployment in green and new technologies. And perhaps most importantly, we need a carbon price to get this throughout into the economy, these new alternative technologies, and to disincentivize emitting technologies. I would like to say that research also has, I think it's really important to mention that and emphasize that research has abundantly shown with empirical data, as we get more experience with these instruments, that in almost all cases, these are net positive in terms of their economic effects. They have net positive employment effects. Even a carbon tax is much less regressive without revenue recycling than is often sort of portrayed in debates and the anxieties before introduction. And as the recent OECD report on the impacts of the European carbon market has shown, even the compliance entities, the energy-intensive trade-exposed industries affected by the policy, even they can have net positive economic effects. But that is very complicated. Communicating that is difficult. These are challenging, scientific and research methodologically challenging, etc. And we know that these policies are so susceptible to being hijacked in the political debate. It's a communications challenge. I think we have to and we can do better in communicating the positive experiences. Citizens in British Columbia who have received checks from the carbon tax there and who are better off, even in low income and middle income households. Still, we know that we have to do this urgently. Speed is absolutely of the essence. And so we have a narrowed window of political opportunity. And that, to me, suggests that we have to go a little bit away also from these first best policies, what MIT, what OECD, etc., would officially recommend, and check what is politically doable. This can be things like reducing taxes and tariffs on clean technology instead of imposing a carbon tax. I also think we have to be honest. The challenges facing low-income and middle-income households, these are distributional challenges. They come from housing, education, healthcare, transportation, and of course, income inequality. It's not a climate policy is not at fault, and it's often been made sort of the scapegoat. But you can design climate policies to try to address that and piggyback on those societal challenges. A carbon tax with revenue recycling can be a massively progressive fiscal instrument. And frankly, the Green New Deal proposed in the United States is trying to use that by bringing in these other problems of healthcare, of education, of transportation and housing in a big package. And I fear, even if that may not be economically the most efficient way, it is perhaps what we need to do politically to reach and meet this urgent challenge.
I clip 1 minute off and want to go pinpoint a question. Where has what worked? I mean, you mentioned British Columbia. What has worked there?
So British Columbia in 2008 introduced a carbon tax. And it was a very controversial and acrimonious political debate, as you might imagine. Initially, the opposition party was pushing against it. So 10 years later, the empirical data showed greenhouse gas emissions have gone down faster than in the rest of Canada. And yet the average per household income and also the fiscal burden has not deteriorated in any way. In fact, GDP in British Columbia grew faster than in other provinces. Part of the design of that tax matters. Every household gets a per capita check, essentially, based or derived from the revenue of that tax. And that has made it progressive.
And there are similar policies out there that could just, inverted commas, could just be applied, and then we could all profit from it.
I certainly think Switzerland is an example. Even our German ökologische Steuerreform, there's good research showing it had very many positive economic effects.
Okay, we'll talk about the communication and the effects of proper communication in a moment. And Richard, can I just give you this microphone? at your service. Richard Reeves, on my right-hand side, has just been working because he's just presented one of his books. He is the director of the Future of the Middle Class initiative at the Brookings Institution in the US. And you're also author of a book called Dream Hoarders, which basically says, and I'm sorry, I seem to have angered my microphone. Sorry. Better? Better now? Okay. So, Richard, the book is very successful because it depicts an upper middle class that manages to hoard the positive aspects of growth and where they're already there. So they defend their position. Now you're looking at those that are squeezed. What about them?
Well, I should start with a confession that I'm probably the only one on the panel that voted in both the US presidential election and the Brexit referendum. So, hey, it wasn't my fault. Non-partisan.
We hope that you voted proper.
Well, I can't reveal how I voted, but I did vote in both. This may be an unhelpful comment in some ways, but I think we shouldn't rush to policy for the following reason. We tend to think we have a policy problem. We don't. We have very good policies that we can talk about that will kind of work. We say then the problem is political. We can't get the political will. We can't make it work politically. But I don't think that's right either. I think underpinning that is a cultural problem. And I think it's a very deep cultural problem, and I think it is as follows. I think it is a growing sense of pessimism. I think it's trust, but underlying that is pessimism. And pessimism, I've come to believe, is the greatest enemy of capitalism. It's not socialism you want to worry about, it's pessimism. Because if people don't believe the economy will predictably and reliably deliver better living standards tomorrow, why save? Why invest? Why risk setting up a new business? Why move to a new town? And so this is, I think the danger of pessimism for market economies is huge. But I also think that pessimism is the greatest enemy of environmentalism. And this will sound odd, because in some ways we sometimes feel that we want to make people more pessimistic, right? We need to scare people into it. But actually, and that we say skepticism will be the bigger problem. I actually think it's pessimism, but here it's pessimism about the capacity of our institutions to effectively and reliably deliver the changes in policy which will actually secure what we need against climate crisis. The populism we're seeing right now is not anti-capitalist populism or anti-government populism. It's both. It's anti-elite populism. And that breeds a kind of pessimism which becomes, at its worst, a kind of fatalism. And it relates to this issue of end of the month, end of the year. Because for effective action on climate change, or the climate crisis, to make it very specific, we need people to do three things. First of all, realize it's a big problem. Right? So can we get agreement it's a big problem? Then we need them to be willing to make some changes and some sacrifices to meet that problem. And people are not willing to do that if they feel like they're squeezed. If they feel like, as you say in the title, at the end of the month, it's hard. And the failure of most of our economies to deliver consistently better standards of living for those in the middle and working class is a huge obstacle to climate change. So we have to make it possible for people to be confident enough, comfortable enough in their standard of living to take it properly. And then thirdly, they have to believe, okay, it's a problem, and yes, I'm willing to pay a small price towards it, but then I'm going to trust the state. I'm going to trust governments to, in a very effective way and a fair way, to act on this problem. And right now, people are deeply pessimistic about that too. And so there's a real problem here, which is unless we can restore the optimism people feel that the economy can predictably deliver higher standards of living, and politicians can predictably deliver high-quality, sustainable policy, then this whole conversation is almost for nothing, because those are the prerequisites for the policy debates that we could otherwise be having.
What you describe is more or less a vicious circle. How do we get out of that?
It is a vicious circle, and I fear that we are in danger of that. I treat the evidence that sort of a lot of younger voters, for all their environmentalism, are also quite fatalistic about the capacity that anything's going to change. And to some extent, that breeds a weird mixture of fatalism and hedonism, which is, look, is the average 25-year-old thinking 50 years from now? Are they thinking about the environment? Or are they just thinking, look, things are really bad. I'm not sure they're going to get any better. I don't see anyone on the horizon that I really feel has risen to the occasion. And so they're spending their money. They are, to some extent, living a little bit insecurely, and it's hard to persuade them. So I don't know, except that it will take a combination of market side changes, unless we reform our form of capitalism to get back to more equitable growth is absolutely number one. Without equitable growth, it's not worth having this conversation, number one. And then number two is the statecraft. If we start to see, and there are examples already, of governments effectively and fairly changing policy radically enough to tackle the climate crisis without hurting ordinary people, then we might start to see confidence grow. But we've got to create that vicious circle with a virtuous circle, and we're right, I think, at the bottom of that cycle.
Thank you so much for this analysis. Now, I'm of course looking at the politicians for a first response. Let me just sort of reverberate a couple of the points that I've heard. We need the just transition. We need a worldwide approach. The IPCC puts out the 1.5 goal as hardly, but just about reachable. And I heard the word losers. And from you, I've heard the word equitable growth and statecraft. Now, assuming there is statecraft, how do we reach the equitable growth, and is there growth? Can there be growth, or is it a redistribution nowadays?
Mais il me semble que le point...
Well, I think your point on optimism is probably the most important. Optimism is the ability to believe that, yes, we can succeed. And when you are young, you hear from the youth more apocalyptic discourses, thinking that everything is too late, that there are no possibilities for a better future. So it's a really violent discourse, rather nihilistic, something that we cannot change anything about it. So I feel like it is up to academicians and and researchers to show that yes, there is a feeling of emergency, that's right. And I think that's something that we've all understood. We've heard too much that there is this feeling of emergency. But we need to also look for solutions, and there are solutions. There are scalable solutions as well. We are at the right time for us to find collective solutions if, of course, we allocate the right resources to these solutions, if we have efficient policies, and if we are ready to take up our own responsibilities. And it's up to the politicians, but not the politicians only. And that's something that we really need to insist on, because otherwise we'll never manage to succeed. Now, the politician's role, however, is to show that it can benefit everyone. And if we did not redistribute growth and redistribute resources, then it is our responsibility to show that we can all benefit from these policies and that we can all benefit from change. It can benefit all households. Now, there's no such thing as the average household. People want to know exactly what they will get from the policies that we implement. So we need to reinstore a feeling of equality, of fairness. In France, we've launched two things that are very much aligned with what you just said. We have a Council of Environmental Defense. So we have gathered a panel of experts to basically say that, yes, there is an emergency and we need to react to global warming. And we are working with this panel to find solutions. And these solutions will need to be defined with us, with the government. And if, of course, we need to go back to carbon tax, of course, it will have to be redistributed only to finance environmental transition. So we need to find this trust and to make sure that we get the trust of the citizens, of the people, so that they can trust those who are in a position of power to change things. And that's how we'll leave this vicious circle and get into a virtuous circle. I think that there's a lack of confidence at the moment, a lack of trust towards those who do have the power to change things.
So you negotiate entre vous. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's just we have to be very clear about just transition, because we have still a problem with the elites, with who is going to pay for this. And that's what we are seeing, the lack in trust for ordinary people. So we have to show that the elite is going to pay their taxes, I'm sorry to say, because we have to have some money on the account and money on the table to make this just transition. So it's very, I'm very glad that you say we have to build trust again to the politicians, to the elites, and that's what we need, and that's what we are in lack of right now. So we have to take care of. We need to take into the account what the effect on workers to make the change.
Workers also means these days white collar. It does not necessarily mean,
It's all people, and they would very much like to participate in this, but they need to see that the politicians, that the elite is going to pay their share too, and we need to see that they are putting, as you say, money on the table.
Part of the whole thing, whatever you want to say, you can say, is this idea there are no losers. But I think I heard from you, sorry folks, we have to be honest, there will be some losers. So how are we going to bring in the losers? How do we make it palatable? How do we soften a transition?
Indeed, it's very correct what has been just said, and I wanted to refer a little bit around the same line. Well, what I'm saying is that Slovakian example again. We talk about the collapse of the regime. Then we had a very tough time, to recover from that. But what we achieved was actually the very solid recovery, whereby we managed economic growth. We decoupled economic growth from environmental degradation, and that's a kind of a miracle, or a symbol how we shall move this transition going, also in terms of decarbonization of our economy and at the end of the day of society. But now coming to these winners or losers, what is truly important that we cannot leave anybody behind, nobody behind. I mean, we need to be very frank, very open on this, that this transition will have some losers. I mentioned the energy-intensive industries, I mentioned digitalization, I mentioned automation, and many other new developments that are shaping our economies, our daily life, and we need to get our workforce ready for the 21st century. There will be lots of new dynamics, lots of innovation. We need to have a very skilled people around that, and we need to focus and invest into requalification and to have some money put aside for that reasons. And the answer is, for example, revenues from auctioning. I mentioned emission trading schemes that is working, and is, of course, carbon price is not there as we wished for, but it's around 20 euros per ton of CO2, and it's very stable, and very likely it will remain at those levels, which is actually a push for innovation, for decarbonization, as said. So I think what is really important that we try to create mechanisms that recycle those revenues, because ultimately the poorest, the most vulnerable, will be hit the most because of carbon taxes or because of new layers of, let's say, cost imposed towards the citizens. So we need the redistribution, the fair redistribution. We need the full recycling of revenues, be it from taxes or be it from the emission trading schemes, maybe to create a European solution for it as well, because if you take purely nationalistic approach, it cannot work at the end of the day.
I've had Michael already sort of going, all of you want to chip in, so let's quickly say, Michael, okay, then you kick off anyway.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to react to a few things. The first thing was your implication that the urgency has been communicated well, perhaps too well, something I can sympathize with, but at the same time I'd remind these are physical facts. This is not negotiable. This is what is happening. And so to me, without being able to offer a solution, I think that this is perhaps the biggest challenge we face, is to reconcile the urgency, the speed with which we have to resolve this problem, and at the same time secure a deliberate, agreed, solid compromise on how to do this. And I would like to underscore how important I think it is that France and other countries are looking at the need for inclusivity, because these are societal questions about how we balance different societal goals. And it is enormously important, I think, to have all the stakeholders at the table in such a process. This is not something that industry alone or politicians alone or environmental groups can solve. All of us have to do it. But again, I think the challenge is, how do we manage to do this fast and efficiently and not have a long, drawn-out deliberative process?
On the issue of communication, I mean, certainly the debate in Germany right at the moment, we're not talking about a CO2 price, we're talking about a CO2 tax. Now, the word tax automatically makes people turn away, and if it's not communicated straight away that there can be sort of offsetting principles, guiding policies behind it, so that we do not have losers, then it's very difficult. So if you talk about tax, people will say, "Blech." If we talk about price, it may be something that is more digestible. It's still a hard thing to follow up. It's you and then Emmanuel.
So briefly, I'm glad we've got carbon tax on the table, because it means there's a policy that everybody sensible is in favor of that would help address this problem, but it's difficult to get through politically. I think we should be honest about the fact that right now, and perhaps from the beginning, environmentalism has felt like an elite concern. Right? And it's very easy then to portray it that way. You can very easily run stories on right-wing TV channels of elite people flying to places for conferences and discussions like this on climate change. Very
You're
elite,
not talking about our favorite British actors,
There are many people who fall into this category, some former US presidential candidates. But anyway, so and I'm not sure that it's going to anytime soon stop being seen as a largely elite concern. Even when people do rank it highly on their list of concerns, it tends to be quite fragile. It can be knocked off that list quite quickly. And so instead what we should be thinking at is, if we're not going to solve that problem, how can we get people to basically go along with policies which we think are necessary, even though they themselves might not feel as deeply about it as we do and are likely never to. And the answer to that is equitable growth and strong and sustainable growth. Gay rights, same-sex marriage was an elite concern all the way through, decriminalization of drugs, etc. These things are kind of liberal elite concerns which you can deliver when everyone feels like they're getting better off. So gross simplification. But absent a sense that middle class and working class people are getting better off, it is much, much harder to create the political space for what remain largely elite policy concerns.
Finally.
Je voudrais revenir à la question des perdants.
I'd like to come back on the issues of the losers in just a few minutes. I think that's an essential point. Because if we want to rebuild trust and be efficient, we need to focus on the losers. There are obvious leaders. In France, I am in charge of shutting down the last coal plants. And of course, there are some people who are working in the coal plants, and by shutting down these plants, people will have to find another job, for example, or they will lose their job. So if we simply say, look, I'm sure that you'll find something else, that's simply increasing that feeling of abandonment from these people. So we need to talk with them and say, look, we are going to be looking for solutions. We'll be looking for private investments. We want to make sure that we provide sustainable solutions for you and for your family, and something that will be putting you in a better position than before. So these might be difficult at first, but we absolutely need to find the right jobs for these people suffering from environmental transition. We have studies that prove that, yes, energy transition can be an opportunity in terms of employment, in terms of jobs. It's true for agricultural transition, for example. But that's something that's very difficult to show to the rest of the citizens, to make it visible. So we have identified the threat. So we need to be able to tackle this threat by concrete decisions. And we need to convince as well everyone that the energy transition can be an opportunity more than a threat. Now, we also talked about the carbon tax, but we talked about green financing as well. And I think that it's very important for financial institutions, banks and assurances to also go through their own transition and invest in environmentally friendly projects as well, because in the end, the environment and the economy are both very closely linked. So we need to be looking for private funding to show that, yes, we can create growth in environment and in global change.
Time that you could chip in on the way there, and we have I believe 2 ladies walking around with microphones so that you can actually put your questions to the panel or your views, and we already see up there one particular question on institutional transformation. But on the way there, Michael, let me just quickly ask you about a practical example. Of course, being German, I might look at some policies in Germany a bit closer than at others. We've had a 20-year transition period to get out of black coal. It was a long pre-planned transition period with lots of engagement with the workers, and of course you don't turn a miner into an IT worker from one day to the next, but you need to sort of give incentives to give jobs. And in the Ruhr area, in North Rhine-Westphalia, it actually has worked quite well. 20 years. We don't have 20 years to do the same with many, many areas. So how do we get the social buy-in just by good communication policy?
Well, I think going back to what you just said, it's very true. Of course, while macroeconomically many of these transformation processes may be net positive, you end up having sectors and individuals who are worse off, at least in the short term. And it's a real challenge. And I think what we saw in Germany, frankly, to put it bluntly and without any decoration, what the Coal Phase-Out Commission agreed upon based on a compromise, a political compromise, was essentially to throw a lot of money at this transformation, to do it fast. This is not economically efficient necessarily, although some economists who look at transformation processes do tend to also look at the big picture and the long term and say that it's more complex than just looking at the static sort of snapshot. But again, the scale, I mean, the problem is physical, the scale and the urgency are huge, and it's not just a problem about the just transition. It is the transition. It has to be just, but it also has to be a transition, and perhaps that is the price we have to pay.
Under which circumstances, Norbert maybe, and then under which circumstances would you get your members to buy into a transition?
Very quickly to refer on the same issue, but I would maybe widen a little bit the scope, because I was speaking a bit more on climate change, climate action, but we face a sustainability challenge. It's much wider. It's also about resources. We're simply, the planet will have more people, so there will be a huge push for new ways of making things. Circular economy and also it's much, much wider. So that's one argument, not to be more pessimistic, but to widen the challenge that we are facing. Where about these coal regions in transition, we have now one region, in Nitra region in Slovakia, that is undergoing this transition, and it's very tough, because we have really very honored miners who feel, you know, their job is the most blessed job ever, and they're not mentally ready to change. So they're really making opposition. It's very loud. There are different groups, of course, but broadly we're quite positive. We are now sketching the pace. It should be very active. And we have now came to a final conclusion. We have it already on a paper, by the way, in a new environment strategy that was just approved recently, that we will phase out the burning of brown coal by 2023. It was really tough to get it politically right. There are still some movements, but we arrived thanks to inclusiveness, thanks to the open and frank dialogue, to a solution that we hopefully we will phase out much sooner as we expected, provided that we have enough jobs and requalification options available for those living there. So it's doable, and we are doing it right now.
Liz, my question again, how would you get the buy-in of your members? Under which circumstances?
We have to be frank that we have to work together to make the solutions, but you also have to invest in people, right? As you were saying before, we have to educate people into other branches on other jobs, and we have to again to invest in people so that they can see that they can move ahead from one branch to another, and they have to have the help. They have to have, could support their families while this is happening. And in Denmark, for instance, we make tripart negotiations to do this. So with the governments, with the employers and the unions, we make this transition so that we can go from from one place to another, and that people don't have to be afraid of what is happening. And of course, there's a lot of people saying, oh, I hope it will help in my time. But it won't. And that's why we have to work together and make those tripart negotiations for countries. But the climate change and the changes we have to make negotiations worldwide. And that depends on politicians who have the courage to make, step a little bit, out from themselves and say what is needed for our, our global worldwide change. And I have to say we have to work together if we have to do this in a fair time.
Talking about the US, of course, we have a situation where a president steps out of certain international agreements, whilst a fairly large part of the populace still stays in. I mean, sort of you don't have any of the international environmental and climate negotiations without the Americans. It's just that state policy might be different, so you might actually have a complete turnaround. So do you still feel that it's an elite question to think about the future in the US? Because in Europe, one could get the impression that people are adopting these questions and seeing them as questions, including resource efficiency. I mean, let's not forget, we've already used up at the beginning of May all the resources that we should have used up in 2019, certainly if we take the European level. We destroy biodiversity around us. People are not blind, people are listening to what's happening. So how could you hold up this idea that it's a lead question?
That's my observation. I'm not a political scientist, but I do see how those accusations of elitism are effectively weaponized. Certainly by the right in the US, but I would argue elsewhere too. And I think that they're able to do that for two reasons. One, this is a classic example of a problem, the minister alluded to this earlier, where the losers know exactly who they are and how much they're going to lose and when. And the winners are some uncertain people who we might find about in the future playing with test tubes on some video that the government's passed. So in other words, the losers know who they are, the winners don't know who they are. And the winners might in fact be low-income people living on the other side of the world 30 years from now, right? So the politics of this are intrinsically horrible. Then you add another element, which is that the people who are going to lose right now are people who are highly salient politically, they are working class or middle class, and you can make a huge amount of hay with that. So the whole coal miner thing, I may get these numbers slightly wrong, forgive me, but my colleagues just put out, from Brookings, put out a calculation that a US carbon tax, I can't remember what level, if you spent 1% of the proceeds on coal miners, you could give each one of them $1 million or something like that, right? And they were using it as a thought experiment to say, you can raise so much money that we could really compensate all these coal miners. I now think that actually maybe we should give every coal miner $1 million, right? Just as an act of kind of crazy, visceral politics, because politics is about people and it's about images. And the populists really get that in a way that the technocrats don't. But I certainly think that we need to take very seriously the fact these are actual people on actual TV screens, and that all the cost-benefit analysis out of Brookings or MIT or Ministries of Finance will never compete with the actual person who's actually hurting right now. And we've always promised retraining and skills and help. Frankly, I've been one of the people that's been promising that on panels like this for 25 years. People are rightly skeptical about whether the money's really going to be there, whether those investments are really going to be made, because it's a really good way for elite policymakers to duck a difficult question on a panel, which is to talk about skills and retraining, right? And I've done it most of my professional life, and I'm kind of sick of doing it because we've never really delivered on it. It's never been real, and people are right to be skeptical when we say it again.
I'm looking for the ladies with the microphone. I've already seen one raised arm. Is there already some person that wants to ask a question? Okay, could you get the microphone to the lady and also to the lady with the green jacket? And meanwhile, no? Okay. Madam?
My question
If you
is,
could get up and just quickly mention your name, that would be lovely. Thank you.
My name is Natalia. My question is on the side of developing countries.
Yeah.
There's a lot of debate about, for example, China that has an economy highly based on carbon and charcoal, and their view on environmental policies that they are viewing as being paying for in terms of their development, because they are not able to spend that well their carbon to energize their economy well, while there is the developed countries already like polluted more, and they are the ones paying, like China is the one paying now. They view that, and how do you feel? And maybe technological transfer is an answer.
Thank you very much for that question. Madam, would you put your question to us as well?
Thank you. I'm Rio Howard, and I just...
So you need to point the
sorry,
microphone
is that
towards
better?
you.
Okay.
Wonderful.
I'm Rio Howard, and I wanted just to ask a question about social media in this context, because it seems to me that this loss of trust in governments and in politicians that we have seen for the last 20 plus years has been exacerbated by the spread of social media, in the sense that it gives every person his platform. Do you need a representative anymore? When you can, at any level, whether it's municipal or regional or national or international, when you can make your own platform. And in fact, one of the phenomena that's characterized the Gilets jaunes in France has been the fact that they have no formal organization except that which they organize through social media spontaneously in real time. So my question is, how do you use that to reconstruct democracy and representative democracy? Because the bedrock of democracy is the representative part of it, and that's what's going away.
Thank you very much for that very interesting question. I'd already eyed Michael to chip in on the China question, and I would love you to continue on that. So maybe Michael, from the Eagles point of view, academic point of view.
I wonder if I'm not more of a pigeon. But so on the point about China, I mean, that very much reflects one of the main arguments that have been used in the international climate negotiations for more than 2 decades. And frankly, I mean, especially in the early stages of these conversations, it was a legitimate point. And it also is very susceptible to some of the same dichotomies that we were just discussing in our context here. It's the long-term versus short-term, who is losing, who is winning, etc. But I think if you look at China specifically, you also recognize that they have reached a state in their own development where it's very clear that environmental protection is not a trade-off with continued economic growth, but rather a condition. Given the pollution problems, local ambient air pollution problems in Chinese cities, etc., this has changed their view dramatically, and also their policies in politics. No other country invests more in clean technology worldwide than China on an annual basis nowadays. I would say also there are mechanisms to try to accelerate, or overcome this obstacle for the least developed countries and less developed countries. There's a technology mechanism under the Paris Agreement. There are climate finance commitments. So we are trying to also tackle that. But I think as these countries develop more, if you look at China, we are also overcoming that dichotomy in the first place.
Thank you very much, Norbert.
Exactly. I wanted to pick up easier one, but this was a very good question on the social media. But referring to the easier one, also in the presence of the French Environment Minister, I think the answer is climate justice. And it's very true what you are saying, that there are some who are not the cause of the current, state of life we are living, but there are others. And of course, this blaming and shaming continues. And the answer is the Paris Climate Agreement. Why? Because it's bottom up. It's actually mobilized all voluntary contributions, which were then turned into the official binding commitment. I'm quite often in the international climate negotiations, and when we came from Katowice in December, we were very happy because now we have a rule book. We have a set of instruments that we can follow, compare, verify, and basically track the progress. So I agree with you, it's not fair, and we are trying to address it through different approach via Paris Agreement. Hopefully everybody will be on board. We have now one country missing, which is not bad at all. We will see how will situation evolve further. We see the push from the cities, from the businesses, from the citizens as a very strong, and I'm sure the current position of one party is just very temporary, and it will get back on track. So you are right. We are trying to find a different approach. It's very good approach because the Paris Agreement is a good and actually one and only reply how we can do it collectively together.
Emmanuel.
I'm going to try and answer the answer on social media because it's a complex answer. Indeed, it's exactly what we went through with the yellow vest crisis in France. And I don't think that this is specific to France. Many people expressed their personal view, saying, I do not want to be represented. And actually, every time the yellow vest movement tried to be represented, they didn't want it. People said, I want to express myself individually, and I want my point of view to be taken into account. Actually, there is an issue which is beyond the issue environment. The question is there any place for representative democracy in the world governed by social media? The first answer is, first of all, we should give more space to direct democracy than it has today. It's exactly what we're trying to do with the Citizen Convention for the Climate. We're going to try and create more popular referendum, citizens' referendum. That is, we're going to invent within the representative democracy more space for direct democracy. Second solution is to try and to find a way for leaders to show that they are listening to citizens and trying to meet their needs. That's exactly what populist leaders manage to do better than traditional leaders. And we've got to find a way of saying we have a mandate. You have given us a mandate, and we're here to answer your needs and what you ask for. And this is the difficulty we have is that we've got to find a collective project and at the same time answer individual needs. And if we cannot find that solution, I think it's the whole of representative democracy which is going to suffer. So your question really goes beyond climate. You are talking and questioning representative democracy. We've got to find a sort of middle way between representative democracy and the need and answering the need of individuals.
But would like to pick it up.
On this same point, I think that there's almost I was going to say a third way, but you have to be careful with that when you're speaking to an Anglo-Saxon audience anyway, or German audience. There is, as a British citizen, the thought of more direct democracy and more referenda strikes me as a bit of a troubling one right now. That's a great example of injecting too much direct democracy into a parliamentary system for bad reasons. But I think there's something else, and it feels to me as if it's more from my little understanding of what you talked about, which is, on the one hand, there's sort of direct, just ask a question. There's representative, which is kind of leave it to us. You elect us, and then we'll look after you. And which is, I think, something closer to a deliberative democracy, which is kind of very intentional about juries, involvements, advisory boards in a kind of non-elite way. Because I think what's happened in social media is that it's created what is almost an epistemological revolution. In other words, what does knowledge look like? Who gets to decide what's knowledge? Who gets to decide what's correct? Where are the experts? You're from MIT? Oh, elitist. why should I listen to you? And the answer is because you know what you're talking about. But in this day and age, actually with social media, it means that the very idea of expertise, the very idea of knowledge is contested. And I think that's really caught a lot of us flat-footed, frankly. I think that sort of the policy elite, technocrats, who are pretty used to a world where mediating institutions, the media, universities, political parties, kind of manage things in such a way that we didn't have to face the kind of brute reality of how people really feel all the time. And I think the new world has just allowed this kind of seismic shift. We've got volcanoes, you know, but the pressure was always there. It was always mediated through these institutions now. So it ain't going to go away. I think that means we've got to up our game, and we've got to be playing a slightly different game. Otherwise, the populists are going to keep winning.
I'm still looking around, but as long as, oh, you have identified somebody, and there is a lady in the first row that I can see, so maybe you turn to the gentleman, then the lady. Do we have a third person for this round? You over there. So maybe we start off with the gentleman at the back here. If you could just get up so that we can see you. Thank you.
Bonjour. J'avais une question.
Good afternoon. I had a question concerning today's subject, i.e., what about, the end of month and end of world? There are crises, and actually, it's perhaps the whole capitalist system which should be changed, because these inequalities are coming from this capitalist systems. And don't you think that actually a minority of people are getting the wealth, and that's why there is a lack of trust? And also, do you think that we can require from everybody the same thing? Because not everybody has the same responsibility. For instance, I can't ask a worker to have the same responsibilities as a politician or somebody who is wealthier. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The lady in the red top or dress. Thank you. And then the person behind me.
Hi, my name's Diana. I'm from the United States, so I'm wondering, for countries like mine, how can we mobilize them to make environmental policy, especially the US, who's contributing so much to the adverse effects of climate change? How can we get those countries to step up to the plate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last, but for this round, there was a gentleman. There you are.
No, I have the microphone.
Oh, you just hold the microphone. Sorry, misunderstanding. So could you take the microphone and come to the first row and help this gentleman gain a voice? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Erkki Ormala, and I have a question which I have been talking for quite a while in Europe, that when we have these kind of taxes for greenhouse gas emissions or carbon taxes or whatever, so it's always a national solution. Why on earth have we not introduced the practice that every product that is producing certain amount of greenhouse gases has to pay the similar tax, irrespective of where it has been produced? That would be exactly the response to your question as well. If the American companies would have to pay a certain tax if they want to export something to Europe. So that probably would be quite an incentive for companies really to try to find solutions. Unfortunately, this was discussed widely in Europe in 2010, but it was at that time felt that it would be too difficult.
Thank you very much for that statement, for your contribution. And I'd like to sort of ask the panel members to respond. Maybe you think about the US-centered approach. Is there a US-centered approach, or can that be transferred to other countries?
Right now, of course, the US is in a horrible mess on this, but I agree that this too will pass. Meanwhile, the energy is moving to states and cities. So I think the answer to that question is we've got to do it city by city, state by state, and then kind of wait for the fever to break at a federal level, which I think it will. I'm pretty optimistic about that. But I think this kind of question, I just wanted to, the point about capitalism, we shouldn't forget that actually it was under the Soviet Union that the lakes were absolutely ruined. You know, the idea that socialism's better intrinsically for the environment is, I think, a complete misstatement of history. And the good news is that in a carbon tax, you've got a capitalist instrument by changing incentives, in exactly the way the gentleman says, to drive the market towards greener outcomes. So a capitalist system which has shifted towards a carbon tax, it would be, I think, both more equitable, but more importantly, kind of more green. The problem with doing it at a global level is the knotty difficulty of national sovereignty. There is no global government, and that's being played very hard by the populists right now. My instinct, though, and I'd be interested in the politicians' view on this, is that if enough countries do it, and they start to put a carbon tax in place, and we look forward with some optimism, 10 or 15 years, I can imagine there being some global governance around the idea that we should start to harmonize our carbon taxes and move towards it. I think that could happen, but it's not going to happen unless countries go first.
However, we do have the EU, for example, in which we have sort of 27 to 28 countries, roundabout-ish, depending on, you know, whether Brexit goes or not. Or so there are agreements.
Yes, they are, and Europe is actually very loyal and respectful to any kind of international agreements. We have to say, when we talk about the climate action, climate change, Europe is a leader. European Union is a global leader who changes the way how also others behave and actually work in reality. So we are proud of it, and we are very determined to do even more on a global level to lead the way towards more climate-friendly world. So it's not about the EU, you know, just to be seen from one angle, but maybe what gentlemen, again, very good question. You know, you see how hard it is, even at OECD place, to arrive at a compromise. At a compromise that is acceptable to everybody. We know that if we talk about the climate change, even, you know, academically on a piece of paper, it won't simply fly. So we live in a world where multilateralism is not delivering as we have expected and as we have actually lived for many years. So it's going to be very challenging. But I can tell you what European Union would do if others don't move or others don't follow. And the regime, now we are working, I'm talking about the emission trading scheme, where we have sort of a carbon leakage mechanism which helps companies to stay competitive on an international basis, provided they have some free allocation of allowances attributed. Now this idea is working, but actually it's not pushing enough. So in EU, we are thinking to introduce, and this is just at the level of debate, a cross-border adjustment mechanism that would force others to respect the standards that we have and actually oblige them to fulfill them. If not, they have to pay extra. It's not very sexy in a world trade world, and also these free trade negotiations. That's why we need to think of environmental clauses in any kind of agreements, bilateral agreements, whatever, that we set the scene, we set the standard, and we would hope that others will follow. We have made in Europe over years the climate change or climate action one of the top 3 priorities, I would say. So we will be doing so, and maybe cross-border adjustment regime is an answer to it, at least for the start.
So the answers are many-faceted. I think Emmanuel this time was faster than Michael.
As regards the, you know, carbon tax on imported carbon, I think it is a good idea. It's an idea that the French government is supporting in the European campaign today, European Parliament campaign today, because we need to make sure that the products which are produced in Europe and comply with these standards have to really not suffer from other products which are imported within the European Union and which have too much carbon. And it's certainly a proposal that the French government is going to put on the table in the next EU discussions. As far as capitalism is concerned, indeed, capitalism must evolve, and that the tax mechanisms are very useful. But we also have to make companies evolve, because they've got to really make sure that environment and social responsibilities are living up to their responsibility vis-à-vis their shareholders. And it's what France has defended in the Pacte law, which is adopted, because for the first time it is written in French legislations that companies are not there only to make profits and to serve the benefits of their shareholders, but that they have a climate and environmental responsibility. But of course, then we've got to see how those who finance and fund companies, banks and shareholders, evaluate the actions of and the results of the companies. They must not only judge the profits made, but also the impact on the environment. And France is working with the OECD and with the ILO on this. There mustn't be, there will not be consensus and agreement with citizens if companies do not contribute their share. And at the moment, the taking into account of profitability is much higher than the taking into account of environmental and climate responsibilities. And I think it's possible. We can make capitalism evolved into a more inclusive system where, the monitoring of the result of a company is not only based on profit. And I think that consumers have also a role to play. And every time consumers choose to buy a product, they've got also to take into account the mode of production. And it's through consumers that we will also improve the situation. Thank you.
Also the ones that are actually going out on the street and say we need to have change. I mean, at least the responsible consumers. However, let me just sort of intervene from a private point of view. I would actually like the system to work so that not every time I eat a yogurt, every time I buy a suit, I need to think about, has this company been possibly responsible in their supply chain? That's hard work, sort of if you next to everything also want to work. Michael, what I got from you in the first answer was we have already systems out there. We also don't just have theories, we also have systems that are working, that have been proved to be working in practice. Why is it so difficult to spread those good benchmarks? And of course you cannot take one example and exactly put it into France, into Denmark, into Slovakia, into the US, but adopt it in other countries fast, because I keep up your word, the sense of urgency is there. So we don't really have the time to do another experiment here and another experiment there, but we need to come to action, to change now.
We'll attempt an answer to that very tricky question. If I may at least briefly also comment on this, because I do want to shout out to the French government, Emmanuel Macron, for holding up this idea of a border and carbon adjustment, again, after the French government in the past has done it many times. And at the European level, it tended to not move forward, the concerns being, we have delicate trade negotiations under the WTO, the Doha round, we have delicate climate negotiations, and they're WTO illegal and would fail in front of. With a group of colleagues who've worked on this for 2 years, we've shown that it is not WTO illegal if it is designed properly. The trade relations are already as frayed as they haven't been in decades, and we have the Paris Agreement. So I think this is the time to march forward, and I really hope that we will see progress on that, because it is a reaction to the fact that we are not moving at the same speed, all under consensus, but we're moving at different speeds on climate policy. There will be differentiation, and I think the Paris Agreement cements that. It in fact sanctions that. That is what we accept now to be the sort of the base of the international regime. Having said that, I also wanted to comment on the question about differentiation. It is a bedrock principle of international climate cooperation that we accept that there are common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. And even if you look at a policy like a carbon tax, well, not everybody's paying the same. Those that emit less, pay less. Those that emit more, pay more. And you can, additionally, with the revenue, make it far more progressive and beneficial for even the low-income groups, which would otherwise perhaps be disproportionately hit. Now to your question. It is a very difficult question. I think what it ultimately comes down to is the politics, the local actors, the local stakeholders, the level of the debate, the level of the culture of the debate as well. And I can only come back to what I said earlier. I think these inclusive processes, using potentially new approaches, new platforms for creating this inclusivity are absolutely necessary. This has to be a debate everybody is part of and everybody can support in order to be sustainable. It cannot be an elite-driven debate only. It's not a technical question. There are colleagues who work on policy transfer, studying policy transfer processes. Again, there's no single one answer to say, well, it worked in British Columbia, so it must work in France. It's not so easy, but we could have an offline conversation on some of the details there.
Well, I mean, we're talking about a many-faceted issue, so even I, who always wants answers, knows that we're not going to have all of the answers in 10 minutes' time. Liz, again, from a trade union perspective, do you see yourself these days as drivers for change, as drivers of governments, like do the right thing?
I see that the climate change as well as the globalization all over has been for too long, has it meant a race to the bottom for workers and for lower wage and lower working people. And we have to change that. Everyone has to listen to that the transitions must be fair. And that's why we would like to attend to the climate change or the changes globally. But we have to make collective solutions for the problems, and that's where we would like to attend. But you said it. It mustn't be the lower paid people who has to pay for this.
And also not the middle classes, and the rich say, why should we?
They should. They should.
So, I mean, in
they
the
can
end,
afford it.
There's one more question before we do the final round, this gentleman, and of course it's an advantage sitting right in the view path of the moderator. Sir.
Excuse me for my English, so I prefer to speak in French.
Yeah.
You haven't talked about lobbies. There are lobbies, oil, energy lobbies in the widest sense, and they've been in existence. And there's been, for instance, a solution. There was a water-based engine that have been in existence for the 60s. And the oil lobby is one of the most powerful lobby in Europe. So why can't we develop water-based engines and use some patents, and the efficiency is very good. It's 100%, whether the petrol-based engine is only 35% efficient climate-wise. So how come?
Just as much as there are policy examples out there, there are lots of technological solutions out there. It's just a question of how to bring them into the market. I would like now to sort of open the last round, which means sort of each and every one of you has a chance for 1 minute. And no, I know there no, it was a typical journalist question, where are the low-hanging fruit? I know there aren't any. But where, from your perspective, should you tackle now first to actually do what we have been talking about since 3 o'clock, get the transition that is out there and that must be made, because otherwise our grandchildren don't have a decent life to live on this planet. How do we get it done in a fair way so that we have the buy-in also of those who are bored right at the moment? I think in English it's called passing the buck. You've got it now.
Oh, I think we should give the people who have to actually argue for this for a living the last word anyway, frankly. It's much harder to do what you're doing. So my own view is that we need to, I agree with the EU is setting the lead. We have to find a way to create some really strong policies. I would put carbon tax, pricing carbon right at the top of the agenda, politically safe. And it can only become politically safe if it is constructed in a way that visibly and viscerally hurts the elite and helps working class and middle class people. Even if that requires doing some sort of really strongly weird and sometimes irrational public policy like giving payouts to miners or whatever, because the cultural resistance is huge. I wish it wasn't like this, but it feels to me as if, as we face the biggest collective action problem arguably of human history, climate crisis, just at the moment when the institutions that have traditionally been able to help us solve those collective problems, governments, international jurisdictions, international organizations, are actually under the biggest political threat. I think we'll ride the storm out, but it requires not just saying this is going to hurt the elite and not ordinary people, but showing that. And not waiting for people who are ordinary consumers, ordinary workers, to suddenly wake up and discover that they've taken the green pill and that they will do whatever it takes to save the planet. That is not going to happen. And so we have to be we need some realpolitik about this, and we need to play the game in the way they are and viscerally help those who need the help most. Otherwise, not only do I think the environment's in trouble, but I think the whole system's in trouble.
Yes, please.
Likewise. Well, thank you. I mean, this was a fascinating debate. I think I didn't really do justice to your question about how can we learn from examples and transfer these. I think we have done an enormous amount of sort of technical sharing of experiences at the bureaucratic, at the technocratic level. What we haven't really done is share those experiences and the good stories with the broader population. That is, I think, really perhaps the biggest gap so far where the challenge lies. So that's where I would place my hopes.
Can I just intervene just very quickly? Do you understand that us journalists should do a different job and a better job at conveying where stories work, i.e. where politics work in a positive way? Because, of course, our focus is mostly on this doesn't work.
Perhaps that generates more headlines. I think our recent Spiegel magazine in Germany seems to have sort of discovered provocation is much more. Well, anyway, I think the journalists are doing a good job. I've been interviewed many times to talk about experiences in the US or in Canada, etc., by European journalists and vice versa. So, but there has to be more, I think. And it has to be translated in a language that is really accessible and hits that individual. How does it affect me? How will it benefit me? And I think in the US we're seeing that for those few moderate Republicans, and the group seems to be growing, at least, of those who are willing to talk about climate change. But also in countries like Canada and Australia, we need to give them backing, political coverage for them in order to have the courage and the ability to go out. So I fully underscore that. And I think, for one thing, voting. I think the fact that the youth, motivated by people like Greta Thunberg and others, are coming out is changing how politicians perceive this. But I also think as we wait to build sort of this political support and groundswell, we may also just in the meantime have to look at the policies that are low, a zero regret for the time being. In the US, in the last Congress, the only policy that was legislation that was passed bipartisan was a tax credit for carbon capture and sequestration. So there are those policies, free market policies or barrier removal policies, tax abatements, tax exceptions, etc. That's perhaps where we have to start now. Sorry.
Whilst the microphone is wandering over to Liz, expectation management, 1 minute per person, and then we finish. Yes.
Okay, then I'll try to be a little quick. Worldwide, the politicians have to face the problems head on. The growing inequality has to be turned. And education, as I mentioned before, should be available to everyone. And the welfare systems also worldwide has to be improved. And the creation of a new decent job has to be promoted. I will say again, green transition demands just transition, and that's what I go
Norbert and Emmanuel, you already have the microphone. You started, so maybe you will finish as well.
Okay, rapidement.
Very briefly. First of all, we've got to show that the technological solutions exist. And we've got to fund research, and we've got to also fund research which are not necessarily beneficial to big companies. But also we've got to make sure that we do not leave losers behind. Thirdly, to increase incentives and constraints, there must be a balance between these two. We've got to work hand in hand with the citizens. And fourthly, we've got to make sure that the economic actors play a fair role in this.
Well, it's easier for me. No, what I would stress, it's the greening of European financial system, world financial system, of greening of our societies, putting the environment sustainability agenda on higher layers. Being a policymaker, I find it very difficult to convey this message through, because the Prime Minister's office or the other sectoral ministries, we keep working in silos, and they think that's climate, oh, it's environment, it's not, it doesn't really concern us. Really, to make it horizontal agenda across the political system, make it very visible in the multilateral system, and try to green through policy actions anything what we can.
Thank you so much. Yes, I know I'm not going to say anything anymore. You've been here, so you don't need my wrap-up. I wish that you become ambassadors for the good ideas that have been conveyed here. Enjoy the next day and a half, and remember, we're not just going to be an elite here, but we're going to talk to everybody out there and take them along. And keep a little bit of optimism. Thank you so much for everybody here on the panel. Thank you for your really good questions, and a good day.